Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yogaha karmasu kaushalam.
Hello students, my name is Ishan Shenolikar and today I will be discussing producer behavior. Let us start with the objectives of the session. First, we will try and understand the meaning of isoquants. Further, we also look at the properties of isoquants. Then we move on to understanding the meaning of isocost curve. Finally, we conclude the session by understanding the producer's equilibrium, where we look at the point of tangency and the least cost combination. Let us start with the definitions of isoquants. Looking at the general definition, an isoquant is a curve that represents different combinations of two or more inputs such as labor and capital that yield the same level of output. It helps in understanding the substitutability of inputs in the production process. Looking at the economic definition, according to Professor Ferguson, an isoquant or an isoquant curve is a curve showing all possible combinations of inputs that are capable of producing a given level of output. Alternative definitions that we have for isoquants, particularly the one given by Samuelson and Nordhaus, is as follows. An isoquant is an equal product curve that shows all possible combinations of two inputs that produce a given amount of output. From the business perspective, in business and managerial economics, an isoquant is a decision making tool that helps firms determine the optimal mix of inputs to minimize production costs while maintaining the desired level of output. Looking at the properties of isoquants, isoquants are an essential concept in production theory, representing different combinations of inputs that yield the same level of output as established by the definition. They have several distinct properties that govern their behavior and shape. Let us look at each of the property in detail. First property is that they are negatively sloped or downward sloping. Isoquants always slope downwards from left to right because if one input increases, the other must decrease to maintain the same level of output. This behavior follows the principle of substitutability between inputs. For example, in a factory, if the number of machines, let's say capital, increases, fewer workers or laborers might be needed to produce the same quantity or level of goods. Looking at an exception, if inputs are perfect complements like a car chassis and wheels which are used in fixed proportions, then the isoquant will not be downward sloping and it will be an L-shaped isoquant. Second property is it is convex to the origin. So isoquants are typically convex due to the law of diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution, which we will see later. In short, the marginal rate of technical substitution or MRTS states that as we increase one input while reducing the other, the rate at which inputs can be substituted declines. This means that as we replace labor with capital, each additional unit of capital replaces less and less labor, making substitution less effective over time. Mathematically, if we think about it, then the slope of the isoquant, that is MRTS, decreases as we move down the curve. If inputs are perfect substitutes, then the isoquants will be straight lines and not convex curved, showing a constant marginal rate of technical substitutions. The third property is non-intersecting isoquants. Two isoquants can never intersect because each represents a different level of output. If two isoquants were to cross, that is intersect, it would imply that the same input combination produces two different levels of output, which is logically impossible. If we assume an intersection at point A, let us say, where both Q1 and Q2, which are two different isoquants, intersect, then it means that it contradicts the definition of isoquants, meaning two different isoquants showing different level of output. There are no exceptions to this rule. This rule will always hold true. Fourth property is a higher isoquant represents higher level of output. The farther an isoquant is from the origin, the higher is the level of output that it represents. Since production increases when more inputs are used, an isoquant further away shows a greater quantity of output than the one closer to the origin. This property helps firms aim for higher production efficiency by moving towards higher isoquants while minimizing costs. For example, we are going to see a graph where Q1 isoquant is a lower isoquant which represents a lower level of output and is closer to the origin, whereas Q2 and the next isoquants represent higher output and are further away from the origin. If production is constrained, let us say due to resource limits or fixed technology, firms may not be able to move to higher isoquants and will be limited to a certain level of production. The next property is no thickness. So, isoquants are thin lines. An isoquant is a thin curve and does not have a width. A thick isoquant would mean that the same input combination can produce multiple levels of output in theory, which contradicts the definition again. If data is imprecise or input measurement is uncertain, practical approximations may cause perceived thickness, but in theory isoquants remain thin and in principle it is not possible. The next property is that the shape depends on input substitutability. The shape of an isoquant depends on how easily inputs can be substituted for one another. There are three key cases for this. One is smooth convex curve, that is typical case where inputs can be substituted gradually. Second is straight line, as we have already seen, if inputs are perfect substitutes, meaning MRTS is constant. And L-shaped isoquants, which is also seen before, that is inputs are perfect complements, meaning substitution is just not possible. There are fixed input ratios. For example, looking at perfect substitutes, electric and gas powered machines. Looking at perfect complements, we have left and right shoes must be used in a fixed ratio. The seventh property is that isoquants do not touch the axis. An isoquant never touches the x axis or the y axis. If an isoquant were to touch one of these axes, it would imply that output can be produced with only one input and zero of the other input, which is unrealistic in most production processes. For example, a factory cannot produce goods with only one or zero labor or capital, or only zero capital, or the other way round. Both inputs are required even if they are used in very small quantities. Some extreme cases like fully automated production, which require only one particular input, let us say capital, or purely manual labor requiring only workers, might make this possible in theory. Further, the next property states that an isoquant becomes flatter as we move to the right side. That is, as we move along an isoquant, it flattens, meaning that the MRTS completely diminishes. Initially, firm can easily substitute labor for capital or vice versa, but as substitution continues, the benefit from the additional input declines. This follows the law of diminishing marginal productivity, which says each additional input has less effect on output after a certain point. For example, initially replacing workers with machines in a factory may increase efficiency. However, after a certain point, adding more machines without enough workers to operate on them becomes ineffective. Perfect substitutes, however, maintain a constant MRTS, so their isoquants are straight lines, not flattening. Looking at the diagram representation of isoquant, here we can see Q1, Q2, Q3 representing 3 isoquants, where as we have already discussed, they follow the properties and the farthest isoquant represents higher level of output. Concluding this discussion, we can say that understanding the properties of isoquants helps firms optimize production decisions by efficiently allocating inputs. By analyzing the shape, slope and position of isoquants, businesses can determine the best combination of capital and labor to minimize costs and maximize output. Now let us talk about the slope of an isoquant. The slope of an isoquant represents the rate at which one input can be substituted for another while keeping the level of output constant. This slope is also referred to as the marginal rate of technical substitution, or MRTS in short form, and it plays a crucial role in understanding how firms adjust their input combinations to achieve efficient production. Let us look at the meaning of the slope of an isoquant. So, the isoquant is a downward sloping curve, which means that as quantity of one input increases, the quantity of other input must decrease to maintain the same level of output. The slope at any given point of the isoquant shows how much of one input is needed to replace a unit of the other input without changing the total production. For example, if a factory decides to use more machines, that is capital, and fewer workers, that is labor, the slope of isoquant will indicate how many workers can be removed for each additional machine while keeping the production constant. Second is the direction and nature of the slope. So, the isoquant slope downwards from left to the right, showing that if one input increases, the other must decrease to maintain the level of output, as we have discussed. The slope is steeper at the left side of the curve and flattens as we move to the right, which indicates that diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution is at play. The reason for this changing slope is that as more and more of one input is used, its effectiveness in replacing the other input decreases. Let us look at the relationship with the marginal rate of technical substitution. So, the MRTS measures how much of one input a firm must give up in order to increase the other input while keeping the production unchanged. The slope of the isoquant represents the substitution rate. If the MRTS is high, it means that a small reduction in one input requires a large increase in the other input. If the MRTS is low, it means that inputs can be easily substituted without significantly affecting production. Now, why does the isoquant become flatter? As we have discussed and looking at it in detail, as one moves down along the isoquant, the curve becomes flatter because the additional units of the increasing inputs become less and less effective in replacing the decreasing input. This follows what is already known as the law of diminishing marginal productivity, which states that as more of one input is used, its additional contribution to the output diminishes. For example, if a company initially replaces its workers with automated machines, the first few machines may significantly reduce the need for labor. However, as more machines are added, the ability to replace workers decreases, leading to a flatter slope. Now, special cases of isoquant slopes are discussed now. First is straight line isoquant. As we have already seen, when inputs are perfect substitutes, that is, they can replace one another very effectively, then isoquant is a straight line, meaning that inputs can be substituted at a constant rate. The slope remains same throughout, that is a fixed rate. Next is L-shaped isoquants. This is when we have seen that the inputs act as perfect complements, such as let us say truck and a truck driver. The isoquant is L-shaped and the slope is either 0 or infinite, thus indicating that substitution is not possible. Let us look at managerial and economic implications of the slope. So the slope helps businesses determine the optimal mix of labor and capital based on cost and efficiency. Firms use the slope to decide whether to invest more in machinery or hire additional workers based on the relative effectiveness of each input. Understanding the slope allows the firms to minimize production costs while maintaining the desired level of output. So if we conclude this section, then we can say that the slope of an isoquant is a crucial concept in production theory, as it determines how inputs can be substituted while keeping output constant. The downward sloping nature of the isoquant along with diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution helps firms optimize their resource allocation. By analyzing the slope, businesses can make strategic decisions to improve efficiency and reduce costs of production. Now let us move to another concept called isocost line or isocost curve. The isocost line represents different combinations of two inputs such as labor and capital that a firm can purchase for a given total cost. It is an essential tool in production theory that helps firms determine the most cost effective way to produce a given level of output. Let us look at the meaning of isocost line. It is similar to a budget constraint as you have learnt in consumer behavior or consumer theory. It shows all possible combinations of inputs that a firm can afford given its budget and input prices. If a firm spends its entire budget on one input, it will be on one end of the isocost line. If it spends entirely on the other input, it will be on the opposite end of the isocost line. Any combination in between represents a mix of the two inputs within the firm's budget. For example, if a factory has a budget to hire workers and buy machines, the isocost line will show all possible ways it can divide its budget between these two inputs. Looking at the equation of isocost line, it is based on the total cost formula, which considers the price of each input and the firm's budget. Although we are not using mathematical symbols here, we can just imagine the equation in the following structure. So the total cost will be equal to the price of capital multiplied by the quantity of capital. So this will be the overall expenditure on capital plus the price of labor, which is generally the wage rate, multiplied by the quantity of labor. So the addition of these two will give us our total cost. This equation forms a straight line or a linear relationship between labor and capital. Looking at the properties of isocost line, then it will always be a straight line. The isocost line is a straight line because input prices are usually fixed in nature, they are constant and we don't assume them to be fluctuating again and again. The negative slope means the line slopes downwards, indicating that if a firm wants to use more of one input, it must use less of the other to stay within its budget, as the budget is fixed. Looking at the position changes with the budget, if a firm's budget increases, the isocost line shifts outwards parallelly, allowing it to afford more inputs. If the budget decreases, it shifts inward parallelly towards the origin. The slope depends on the input prices. So if the price of one input rises while the price of other input remains constant, the slope of the isocost line will change, because now the firm will be able to afford more or less of the input in which there is a price change, thus reflecting the new cost trade-off between inputs. Now combining the two concepts that we have learnt, that is isocost line and isoquant, this allows us in finding the optimal input combination. The goal of a firm is to produce a given level of output at the lowest possible cost. The optimal point occurs when an isoquant which shows the output is tangent to an isocost line which shows the cost constraint. At this point, the firm achieves cost minimization, meaning it is using the most efficient input combination to produce the highest level or desired level of output. For example, a business might decide on a mix of labor and machinery that allows it to produce goods at the lowest cost while maintaining efficiency. Looking at the shifts in the ISO cost line, the ISO cost line can shift due to the following reasons. First is change in budget. If the firm's total budget increases, the ISO cost line will shift outwards parallelly, meaning it can afford more inputs. If the budget decreases, it will shift inwards. Second is, as we have seen, change in input prices. So, if the price of labor or capital changes, the slope of ISO cost line will adjust, reflecting the new cost trade-offs. For example, if wages increase but machinery prices remain constant, firms may shift towards capital intensive production, that is, more machines and fewer workers. If machine costs increase, firms may shift towards labor intensive production, which requires more workers and fewer machines. Now let us look at a special case of ISO cost line. So first is parallel shifts. So if total cost increases or decreases but input prices remain the same, the ISO cost line shifts parallel to the original position. Rotation of ISO cost line, this is dependent on the price of one input change while the price of other input remains constant. This means that it alters the cost structure of production. Let us look at the managerial and economic implications of ISO cost line. So basically it helps the firms decide the best combination of inputs to minimize costs while maintaining output. It assists in determining whether to invest in capital intensive or labor intensive production. It also provides insights into the effects of changes in input prices on production decisions. If we look at the diagram of ISO cost line as per our discussion, then it is a straight line and it can shift parallelly outwards, meaning you can afford more of both, or the overall budget has expanded, and if you look at it with a parallel shift downwards or inwards towards the origin, it means that the budget has decreased. If we conclude this particular section, then we can say that the ISO cost line is a fundamental concept in production theory, helping firms understand the cost constraint they face while choosing the best input combination. When combined with ISO quants, which we will see later as well, it enables businesses to optimize resource use and achieve cost efficiency in production. Let us now move to the equilibrium condition, that is the combination of ISO quant and ISO cost line, which is also called the least cost combination. So the meaning of producer's equilibrium is as follows. A producer reaches equilibrium when they maximize output at the lowest possible cost or minimize cost for a given level of output. This happens when the firm selects the optimal combination of inputs, let's say capital and labor, based on the ISO quant and the budget, that is ISO cost line. The equilibrium occurs at the point of tangency between an ISO quant and ISO cost line. So tangency is when a curve touches a straight line, or a straight line just about touches the curve, not just intersecting but touches on the outside. So this is where the firm's cost is minimized for a given level of production. This point is known to be the least cost combination of inputs. Let us look at the condition for producer's equilibrium. A firm reaches the least cost combination when first the ISO quant is tangent to the ISO cost line. The point where an ISO quant touches an ISO cost line represents the optimal input combination, because any other combination would either cost more or produce less output. At this point, the firms are efficiently using their resources to achieve the desired level of production at the lowest cost. Next aspect is that the MRTS equals the ratio of input prices. We know that the slope of ISO quant is called MRTS, and the slope of budget line is nothing but the relative prices of the two inputs. If we say that there is a point of tangency, then at equilibrium the substitution rate must be equal to the ratio of input prices, ensuring that the firm is minimizing its production cost. Let us look at the explanation of least cost combination. The least cost combination refers to the optimal mix of labor and capital that allows a firm to produce a given level of output at the minimum cost. If a firm deviates from this combination, either the same output can be produced at a lower cost or more output can be produced for the same cost. The firm adjusts its input usage until it reaches the equilibrium point, ensuring efficient resource allocation. Let us look at or understand the graphical representation of equilibrium. The isoquant curve represents all possible combinations of inputs that produce the same level of output. The isocost line represents different combinations of inputs that the firm can afford within a given level of budget. The point of tangency between the two curves represents the firm's equilibrium where the least cost combination is achieved. So, at this point, the slope of the isoquant MRTS is equal to the slope of the isocost line, that is the price of both the inputs. The firm cannot reduce costs further without lowering the output. Now, looking at the changes in the least cost combination, the least cost combination can change due to either changes in input prices, that is, if the price of labor increases while capital remains constant, firms may shift towards using more capital and fewer workers. If the price of capital increases, firms may shift towards using more labor instead. The second aspect is changes in budget. If the firm's budget increases, it can afford more inputs, shifting the isocost line outward. If it decreases, the isocost line will shift inwards, restricting input choices. The other aspect is an external factor, that is technological changes. Advanced technology can improve productivity, allowing firms to produce the same output with fewer inputs. This shifts the isoquant, leading to new equilibrium with lower costs. Now, looking at the importance of the least cost combination, it allows cost efficiency, that is, helps the firm minimize production costs. It allows optimal resource allocation, that is the best mix of labor and capital, and profit maximization, that is lower cost lead to higher profit. Further, it also aids better decision making. It helps businesses decide whether to invest in labor intensive or capital intensive production. Looking at the diagram after this discussion, you can see that there are multiple budget lines, and the second budget line, that is BB1, is tangent to the isoquant. However, the isoquant is also tangent to other budget lines, but those combinations are not possible. They are beyond the scope of the firm, and hence the point R, which is the tangency condition, represents the optimal choice of the firm. Concluding the session, we can say that the equilibrium condition in this production is met when the isoquant and isocost are tangent, ensuring least cost combination of input. At this point, the MRTS is equal to the input price ratio, and the firm achieves cost minimization for a given level of output. This principle guides businesses in optimizing resources, allocation of resources in a better manner, and improving efficiency in production. I hope you understood and enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.